Welcome to the Festival of Tomorrow. Everyone who's joining us. First, I wanted to introduce Paul Crawford, who is a Professor of Health at the Institute of Mental Health University in Nottingham, UK. He's recently published a book, Cabin Fever, and led a mental health campaign called What's Up With Everyone with Aardman Animation, the team behind Wallace and Gromit. So, Paul, can you just kind of tell us a little bit about that, really, how you came to research and write the book, really, before we get into any other questions?
Well, welcome everybody from all your cabins, wherever they are, for joining us today. So back in what I call lockdown 1, when I was on my own for 6 months and my wife was in Taiwan, I had a kind of a castaway moment, urban desert island, a Tom Hanks sort of feeling to it, and started to wonder how I would survive this kind of earthbound kind of spaceship, how I will manage in the weeks ahead. So I think, like a lot of people around the world who've been caught up in what is actually the greatest confinement of human beings in history, about over 4 billion people at some point over the last year have been confined to their different accommodations, experiencing different kinds of lockdowns, actually, different kinds of isolations. And the book that I wrote with my son, Jamie, Cabin Fever, Surviving Lockdown in the Coronavirus Pandemic, really came out of the threat of boredom and the threat of, what the hell am I going to do with my time in the house on my own? And I'm sure lots of other people had some similar challenges. So Jamie was lodged on the Ottawa River in Canada with his girlfriend, and I was here with my cushion because I thought I'd do a Tom Hanks, and I sent pictures of my wife off to some photo company, and they printed her face double-sided on a cushion, so I could actually, have some company through the day. But quite seriously, the book is a journey into where does cabin fever come from? What's its history? How does prolonged confinement affect mental health? And what can we learn about it in terms of cabin fever on land, at sea, in the air, and as Beth, I'm sure, is going to fill everybody in a moment, in space. And what kind of balance can we get, between the benefits and positive aspects of this kind of strange sabbatical that we're all experiencing, and the darker side of that? What are the antidotes we can apply as a kind of vaccine to extreme boredom and all the social and emotional challenges we're experiencing?
Yeah, no, that sounds pretty valid for everyone at the moment. I think we've all been struggling, and as you can probably see on my background screen here, we usually come from the Steam Museum, and that's where we were last year. And so we are spiritually coming from the Steam Museum, but the pandemic has obviously hit us, and we're all kind of confined, as you describe. And I think everyone can't wait to be back there and actually see people. So hopefully, in the Hoover app, when people are going around, you can actually chat to people. So we're not just looking at Zooms, you can actually chat to all the people who are here, and you can meet Paul and Beth actually in Hoover. I think Paul's going to be in his booth later. But I'm going to introduce Beth now. So Dr. Beth Healey, she's currently working as a doctor in the intensive care unit at Bristol Royal Infirmary. And as part of medical and logistical support team, she's worked in a number of extreme and remote environments, including Svalbard, Siberia, Greenland, the North Pole. Actually, as research MD for the European Space Agency, who are also here this weekend, she overwintered in Antarctica. If you're wondering why that makes sense for the Space Agency, they've got a spaceflight analogue called Concordia, which is known as White Mars. So her research actually helps inform the space agencies on how to tackle the challenges facing future astronauts on really long duration spaceflight missions. So dealing with exactly these challenges that we're all dealing with now. So Beth, over to you. Can you tell us a little bit more? And I think you've got a few images to show us about what that actually looked like.
Exactly. Thank you, Rob. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. So yeah, thanks very much. I'm Beth. As Rod kindly introduced, I'm currently working in intensive care, but previously I've been working for the European Space Agency out at spaceflight analogue Concordia. So ESA have lots of different platforms which in some way replicate space. And particularly at Concordia and in Antarctica, we're looking at the isolation that future astronauts might face on those missions. So this is Concordia Station, and my bedroom is actually that little blue light that you can see on the sort of middle station there. So Concordia is about 1,300 kilometers from the coast on the Dome Charlie Plateau. And the reason that it's interesting is twofold. So the first is that we have really cold temperatures, so about -80. And also we have the long polar night, and this was a picture of me taken around lunchtime at Concordia. And those two factors together mean that the crew at Concordia are completely inaccessible for 9 months of the year, a lot like what you might be feeling during coronavirus. If we compare this to the International Space Station, if we're to have a medical problem, normally we can get down from space within sort of a day, half a day, if there was to be a medical problem. But as we're looking at going further into space, that's no longer going to be possible. And so our experience at Antarctica, and also the experience that we've all been having in lockdown, becomes all the more relevant as the crew's going to be increasingly isolated. There's a few other things which make Antarctica and Concordia a lot like spaceflight. So we're a small international crew. We also have a lot of monotony, which I think we can all relate to. And also there's a lot of sensory deprivation as well. You don't have any open water, you don't have any plants, no animals, no penguins, unfortunately, at Concordia, and a lot of sensory deprivation. We also do water recycling to help develop sustainable habitats for sort of extraterrestrial habitats. And also we look at growing sort of innovative farming as well. We also have remote medical care, which again has been really relevant during the coronavirus pandemic. And we also have limited supplies on station. And we have to bring all of those supplies as part of an overland traverse. And so this is actually something that I got to be part of as well during the summer to resupply the station. And all of this information has helped us to develop more interesting and more sustainable habitats, which also help to maintain good mental health and good well-being in these periods of isolation, as exemplified by the new research station, Healey, which has been developed with all of this research in mind to help take care of the crew. It's a really beautiful place, and I'd love to share with you more pictures, but I'm afraid I think Rod would get upset if I do. So I'm just going to leave you with a few aurora pictures. And this is a picture when the sun came back to us after 3 months of total darkness, a really emotional time. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Beth. I think Beth's going to change devices now from laptop to phone just to increase volume. But we could hear you fine, actually, Beth. That wasn't a problem, actually. Thank you for speaking up. So you did have a question in the chat. Banner was just checking, Beth, how long you were there, which you did say it was. What was it, 6 months you were there in Antarctica? You overwintered.
Oh, I'm back. Hello. I was in Antarctica for 14 months, but we were isolated as a crew for 9 months of that. So, so 9 months without seeing anybody else, but then I was there for 2 summers in between. And the second summer I was doing the overland traverse. So I was there for, a pretty long time.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, I'm going to bring Paul back in as well now. So we're just kind of, I thought it was really good to get an introduction. I think even though I've seen what you do, Beth, and I couldn't picture a lot of that before seeing those. It does look pretty hardcore. I don't want to replicate that one. I have got a question about how cold it was actually, and then we will go on to the rest of the talk.
So pretty chilly. So it was always very cold. So in the summer, you're talking about -30. But you've got to remember that it was quite a dry climate. So I sometimes actually went outside in a t-shirt, -30 if it was nice and sunny. But then during the winter time, it was absolutely Baltic. So it was -80 degrees centigrade consistently. It never went above -70. And I think the coldest temperature we had was something like -82, I think, as a crew. So it was very stable stable climate, and that's actually why Concordia is built where it is, because it's a really good place for drilling because of how stable the climate is there. So it was the kind of cold that, like, if you like sprayed we had a fire hose and you could spray that out through the door and all of the water would evaporate and just freeze before it hit the ground. It was that cold. It was crazy.
Yeah, okay. So we've got the idea that, yeah, it's pretty extreme. And we'll get on to the difference between isolating in different weathers actually a bit later, or different climates times of the year. Paul, you said earlier that the pandemic has actually created the greatest global confinement in human history, which is a bit of a statement. So it'd be good to kind of explain that. And also, whilst it's affected people differently, it does feel like a very new experience for most people.
Yes.
And even though everyone's having different experiences, we're all having a different experience. And it's this actually, when we promoted this talk, this event on Facebook and social media, this was the one that got people the most upset. Actually, we got these comments, either people saying, "Get over it, what's the problem?" or other people saying how terrible it is for people. And so it's a real. It really quite divisive, actually. People are finding it, I think overall, people find it quite stressful. What do you mean by that greatest pandemic? Is it affecting for people? And then, we'll get on to what is the first thing we should be thinking about in terms of antidotes?
So just to follow up really from Beth's example there of that kind of analogue situation. Of course, on the science side, whether you're training for space and so forth, there's kind of a defined purpose to that, and people are voluntary in taking up that type of environment. Of course, around the world, millions, billions actually, of people have been subject to lockdowns, involuntary lockdowns, which are probably more akin to experiences of being taken hostage, solitary confinement and imprisonment, and so on. And trying to, we may want to think about, actually, and NASA, I'm sure, are thinking about that, but we may want to think about the whole world during the last year as an analogue station for preparing for Mars travel. I think the general public now are fully prepared to be sent off into space on a long journey to Mars. We've had global astronaut training in a way during this period. But in the book Cabin Fever, my son and I were actually really surprised that there wasn't a great deal about this kind of culture-bound syndrome where people get restless and irritable with long periods of time either spent on their own or with others. The depression and anxiety that can result from that, but also confusion. So when we looked into this, we thought, I bet all of you out there were thinking, oh yes, cabins, cruise ships, boats, naval history, and so on. Actually, when we looked at it, we were really shocked to find that the earliest reference about this was in relation to outbreaks of the infection typhus in Ireland. So during the Great Famine in Ireland in the 19th century, typhus really took hold. And it took hold in very poor dwellings, single-room dwellings called cabins. And the density of people in sanitary conditions and so on meant that typhus really spread. And when many Irish then emigrated to North America, they not only brought typhus with them, but they brought a cabin mentality and a cabin architecture. So the Irish and Scots were the key people in North America, actually building those frontier cabins and setting up in remote areas. And eventually, although we can't determine the transition point, we had a transition point in our cultural understanding between physical infection and fever, heightened temperature, and all the other things we've gotten more used to now as an issue, and psychological fever and restlessness. So this is where the history came from in terms of cabin fever, but a lot of the experiences of prolonged isolation and so forth, and the impact on our mental health have been very well established, not just in Beth's side on analogue station research for space, etc., but also in relation to prison environments, Rod. So, you know, we know solitary confinement is very, it's deleterious, injurious to people. It's not good for their mental health, you know, and their mental state. And we've seen recently with Princess Latifah, of course, and the apparent house arrest and her solitary confinement. This is a very real issue. But even if you're not on your own, some people are having lockdown with their children, right? And that isn't very easy for a lot of people, especially with homeschooling. So when we think about lockdown across the world, don't think one thing, don't think one kind of lockdown. And even, you know, the space version is a rather defined area and quality to lockdown compared to what many people are experiencing now.
Nice. That's a really good point. Everyone's experiencing different. We've got a couple of Q&As coming in. I'll keep to. We'll try and get a lot of Q&As in towards the end, actually. Some of them we'll kind of raise as we go. But I wanted to kind of get on to one of them was about, you know, actually that difference. People experience different ones. If you've chosen lockdown, it's different from, you know, if it's imposed on you. That's really true. The first, we want to get into some antidotes, really. How can people do things to kind of help themselves? And I think one of the first things I think people might relate to, but not everyone can do it, is the being outside, kind of access to nature. Is that something you touch on, Paul?
Yes, there are a number of antidotes, and I think, you know, Beth will probably talk about these as well. But I would say that perhaps the most obvious one to people, especially in the first lockdown, as I think of it, is the access to nature. We suddenly heard birds, and nature kind of came to us. We were outside, perhaps having barbecues, social distance barbecues, and this mitigated the effects of the social confinement and isolation during that period. Of course, rather predictably, as you move to the winter and wintering through, both in terms of access to outdoors and so on, then that's become less possible. And we've also, you know, lacked, you know, a great deal of sunlight during the period as well. That also impacts. But then you have to look a little bit more widely even than the weather, and in terms of people's, you know, social and economic situations. But what I would say is that nature's one of the first port of calls, isn't it? To be outside, to escape a closed, perhaps claustrophobic environment for some people. And not everybody's had that access either, Rod, you know.
No, that's true. I mean, it's very depends on where you live and all sorts of things. But so Beth, I mean, that must have been, you said sometimes you were able to get out and, you know, even in a t-shirt despite the cold, which does sound surprising. But I mean, there must be times when the weather was just too hostile and you were stuck inside completely.
Exactly. I mean, I totally resonate with what Paul says in terms of that the experience that I had in Antarctica was different to, of course, what we're experiencing during this lockdown with coronavirus. But I think also any sort of experience isn't sort of generalizable. So sort of different overwinters have had different experiences based on the teams that they're with. I think one of the good things about Concordia as a model for isolation is the fact that the crew are completely isolated during the winter time. So if you compare that to a model like Mars 500, for example, where the crew were in sort of a mock-up spaceship doing a sort of simulated mission to Mars, then during that experience, I actually personally would have found it a lot more difficult because they actually had the choice to leave if they wanted to the program. And I think psychologically that was a lot of pressure to put on them. And I also actually found personally the summertime a lot more tricky before I actually overwintered, because at that point I still had the option to leave. And actually sometimes when you don't have the choice and you're sort of in that experience without a choice, sometimes it can make it not easier, but a different kind of psychological pressure on you. And I think also I completely agree with the fact that everybody has had a very different experience with isolation and lockdown this time. Not only myself, because I've been going to work every day as an ITU doctor, so I've actually been seeing lots of people during the isolation period. But having said that, I do also feel isolated in different ways, because you can't escape work, because you sort of come home and like everything that's on the TV is all about coronavirus, and you're not able to use like normal coping strategies that you would do in normal day-to-day life, where I just go sort of out, see friends, do other things, and sort of offload from work. So and I think that while nobody's having the same experience, I think that we can learn from each other and learn from the experiences that other people have had about sort of different coping strategies. And that was a big thing which we did with the European Space Agency before we left, and we had what's called like human behaviour performance training. And it was all about sort of learning about yourself as an individual and how you coped in different sort of environments and in stressful situations, and learning about the team that you are isolating with as well. And I think that there's a lot that we can learn from that. And I think that one of the biggest differences and biggest challenges I think that we're all experiencing during coronavirus is definitely the unknowing of how long we're going to be isolated for. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges, which again isn't represented in something like Antarctica, where I knew that hopefully, as long as something didn't happen to the plane, that this would all end after 9 months. Whereas for us, it's a very different kettle of fish, sort of all being a little bit uncertain about how long it's going to go on for.
Yeah, that touches on a couple of questions and comments that have come in actually. So someone asked about, and it does lead us on, about how you can mentally prepare for isolation, partly when you know it's coming, partly when you don't know or you don't have. So how do you? It's not just the going through it; it's like preparing yourself mentally to go through it. And then, someone brought up, someone called Errol Graham actually in Q&As. Who, again, people really, really struggling, and there's some, some interesting history there.
Yeah.
But how do you get through it? And part of that seems to be about acceptance of the situation you're in, which you can do to varying degrees depending on what's going on. Is that a really key bit, accepting your situation? I think you talk about that, Paul, in the book, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, I think Beth and I are looking at similar areas, and it's great to hear Beth thinking about the variety of challenges here. One of the key things that does cut across is the whole business of having purpose, and having goals. And of course, when you're thrown into a situation where you're waiting, and we know from previous history and experience, for example, in the Second World War, the Germans referred to this as prisonitis amongst prisoners of war. This this very, very strong mental challenge of being in prisons. And we often hear terms such as being stir crazy, which means actually becoming mentally unwell in prison. So in terms of preparing, it's very difficult, but I would say that you need to be thinking of a number of things. So obviously we mentioned about the value of nature if you can access it, which isn't always possible. And some people have had to shield quite, in a strong way during this period. There's also the whole business of psychological adjustment and accepting what they call the new normal. And it takes some thinking through and some working through and feelings as well in accepting the new normal, of course, and making as much social connection as you can, digital or otherwise, with social distancing. But I think the key one is perhaps for the person that asked that question, is beginning to look at goal and purpose and having the structure and a direction to your day as much as possible, which of course astronauts get on, they almost have to buy into that because they've got so many experiments to do and everything else. The other thing is to conceive of your environment perhaps a little bit differently and challenge the prison conception with a sanctuary perception of your environment, and of course look after the body. And we all need to do that in terms of nutrition, hydration, sleep and exercise. And one area which perhaps the person calling in can think about in terms of preparing is what my son and I did, which was creative survival. We know during the pandemic, so many people have been bashing their saucepans, singing in the street, doing nighttime discos. I did nighttime discos, sadly, on my own. While my wife was in Taiwan, I did solitary discos in the kitchen.
Are there any videos, Paul?
Sorry?
Are there any videos?
Unfortunately, yes. But I'm lucky because I'm a writer, and my son is a really good writer as well, but he didn't realize it until he did this book. So that was a creative thing we did, and we had purpose, for a few months during this isolation period, and also, painting pictures. Now, not everybody can respond like that. And look, I don't want people to think, oh, well done you got all creative. But the fact is, many people in many countries have survived the experience of isolation through creative practices, through singing, joining in with creative arts and crafts and so on. It's a serious antidote. And it helps to occupy us, to pass the time, the dead time. They call about, in prisons, they call it the dead time, passing the dead time. And we've all been, if you like, non-criminal prisoners in some ways, in some form. And for a lot of people, sadly, unfortunately, it's led to violence, it's led to suicide around the world. We heard recently about this in Japan. We've had an elevation of domestic violence, which is disgusting, but it's worsened due to cabin fever. And we know there is a correlation between that culture-bound syndrome and domestic violence. So, children, young people as well have suffered at the hard end here, where they can't escape their environment, where they're confined to being with people they can't stand who are threatening to them. So don't think for a minute that there's easy antidotes. Don't think for a minute that some people are just, shall we say, bigging up the challenge, grow up, man up, come on, toughen up, the lot of you. I think people need to spend a day as a domestic violence victim in a lockdown, and then they can do all their easy shouts.
Yeah, I think it's very easy to assume that everyone's going through the same thing you are, and I think that the domestic abuse is a real challenge in this time. So that's certainly something. And there are. In Swindon, there's a great charity, Swindon Women's Aid, actually Swindon Domestic Abuse Services, that help deal with that, which I could put people in touch with if they need that. Absolutely. I think bringing on your that thing about the bored and the dead time. Someone's asked about that. How do you fill the time when you're bored? And I expect even Beth, you don't have that much. Sometimes you've got lots of work to do, sometimes you don't. When you're in Antarctica, these are the places. And the other question that people have asked about that you could touch on as well is that social connectedness. So particularly students who are either distance learning or they're away in student halls, but then having to isolate away from their family and their support networks. So Beth, how did you cope with the loneliness and the separation and the dead time? If you could cover those.
So I think a lot of what Paul was saying about sort of finding motivation is really important. So I think what we found generally with Antarctic overwinters or any period of isolation really with research is that you have what's called the third quarter syndrome. So the hardest bit typically is the third quarter of any mission. So the initial part, and I think we can probably all relate to that, is the beginning that we all went into lockdown. Although we had some anxiety about what was happening in the world, I think a lot of us found it quite a positive experience. There was a lot of sort of camaraderie, as Paul mentioned, people doing clap for carers, and there was a real sense of community in the world, and everybody coming together, and I think that's also reflected on expeditions and things. Everyone's on like their best behavior at the beginning, and everyone's really excited about the experience. And even though we weren't perhaps excited, I think a lot of us were very motivated having that period of time off. I know that loads of people did huge sort of DIY projects and really sort of a lot of people, I think, enjoyed having that period of time to themselves to do various things, you know, sort of whether it's taking up new hobbies or sort of starting a new project or but then what happens is you start to get tired, and that's normal in any isolation period. And I think we all have to sort of be kind to ourselves as well and realize that that sort of level of motivation isn't likely to sort of continue through the whole period of isolation. And, you know, if you do want to have duvet days and sit and watch TV for the entire day, then I think that is okay occasionally, not all I'm not advocating that for all the time, but I think it's just accepting that you probably, you're not going to be functioning at your sort of normal level of function. And I think accepting that is really key, really, rather than trying to get frustrated with it. I think one of the things that I found useful during this isolation, having been in Antarctica, is actually what I found. So going back to the third quarter thing. So then after midwinter, then you sort of midwinter for us being the middle of the Antarctic overwintering experience, then everybody really started to struggle because it's a long time since the beginning of the expedition started. You're all pretty tired, but it still feels like a really long way to the end. And I think that's the kind of period that we're all in at the moment. You know, the vaccination's coming. We know that it will end at some point in the future, but nobody really knows when. And then actually the last phase, this final quarter, even though that's when you've been in the period of isolation the longest, because you know that it's going to end quite soon, you suddenly start to see all the benefits of that experience. And that certainly happened to me, you know, and I was like, oh, you know, I wish I'd done all these things which I was planning to do when I was in Antarctica. I was like running around the station taking photos, doing all this stuff, like packing up the experiments and just like getting ready for the next phase. And it was actually probably one of my favorite times in Antarctica, even though I'd been there the longest. And you would have thought maybe that at that point I would be the most tired. And I think if we can try and get into that mindset that it's going to end soon, and actually try and think about all the positive things about this period of isolation as well, that can also be really positive. So trying to think about things which you wanted to do during lockdown, and which when you look back on this period, is there going to be things which you regretted not doing, like did you want to paint your room or that kind of stuff, and like actually try and sort of use this time, because it's not going to be there forever. And I think for a lot of people as well, it has been positive, and it's given a lot of people a period of time to really reflect on what it is they're doing, what direction they're taking in life, and where they want to go in the future. And I think that was one of the biggest things as well, which I took from my experience of going to Antarctica, because it's actually a real privilege to sort of stop your life for a moment, because I think otherwise it's really easy for us to just continue with what we were doing and not think about things. And I think actually us all being forced to kind of stop and think about stuff can also be a positive thing as well. And I'm not saying that the whole experience has been positive, of course. I know that a lot of people have had a lot of challenges, and I certainly within intensive care have seen probably almost as many people die of sort of overdose and suicide as I have of coronavirus as well. So I'm very acutely aware of the problems that people are having, and that there does need to be a lot of support out there for people as well. So I'm not saying that it's all happy days, but I think just trying to get the right sort of positive mindset can really be beneficial for people.
Yeah, I think there's a few things there. So we've had that kind of being outside the nature stuff if you can, which is really important. There's clearly a big mindset issue, and Paul referenced something earlier which I think helps me, and people have talked about before, talking about trying to get yourself in that position where you're thinking of your confinement as a sanctuary rather than a prison, if you can. And that's not everyone's situation, clearly. And I think there's a few of these antidotes that, different ones will be useful at different times. We talked about,
I think as well, like defining your habitat and defining your space is really important. So this was one of the big learning points at the human behavior performance training before we went down, was about really defining the station. And so we had bedrooms as completely private areas. So if you went to your bedroom, even your best friends that you like hanging out with all the time would never come and knock on your door, because it was a sign that you just wanted to be on your own and have your own space. And while not everybody has the luxury of having their own room, you can make like dens for people, or just like little areas, like if it's a garden shed or something, or some way of defining a space where you can just take a few moments. And actually I think just psychologically knowing that it's there means that you have to use it less. Like I didn't actually go to my room a lot to be on my own, but actually knowing that I had that space if I wanted it and when I wanted it was really beneficial as well. It gave you sort of a bit of energy, really.
I think that's a really, helpful and practical approach to lockdown and environments. I guess for some people, Beth, that well, perhaps for more people, the environments can be quite restricted. I'm thinking of like the university students in their landlocked cruise ships, the halls of accommodation, where perhaps it's a little bit more basic and a little bit less definable, shall we say, in terms of spaces. There's a great question I noticed there, Rod, from Thomas about, the value of creativity and defining your space, and creative about your space, Beth. And then there's all the depletion of theatres and jobs of creatives and so on. Just a bit of comfort, Thomas. Totally agree with you, by the way, that this is a big challenge economically for the arts and for all people involved. But we kind of bucked the trend a bit recently with, I had the privilege to lead the What's Up With Everyone project with Aardman, which launched a couple of weeks ago, which is a series of 5 short animations made with young people for young people. It was set up before COVID, this was, to try and support mental health of people in transition to adulthood, 17 to 24-year-olds. And you can go to whatsupwithEveryone.com and also Aardman's YouTube channel and see these 5 new characters, these new Wallace and Gromits, as I think of them, or Shaun the Sheep, times 5. But anyway, they're fantastic characters made by Dan Binns and for us for this project. And just in answer to Thomas, really, that during the COVID, Aardman is a creative industry. It has people working in its industry, making animated stories, and we've been part of that economy. So there are many ways that we try to build back resilience into our economy and into our societies. And I think, Beth, you touched on it earlier about learning points. We learnt across history the value of monastic traditions in terms of having reflection time, having time to consider where we are in life. So in a way, although this has got some very dark sides to it, very dark actually in terms of mental health for many people, including our young people, there are also these opportunities to look again, to research, to re-look at the world and the way we are in it and how we work in and what we're doing. So it's a mixed bag, I would say, but whether you're suffering cabin fever or enjoying cabin fever, it makes sense as much as possible to look at how you make the most of your environment and how you find as much sanctuary at this time.
One thing we haven't touched on is physical health, and that's not. I mean, I tried to do lots of workout in the first one in that big enthusiastic first pandemic, and then injured my shoulder. So you can overdo it, and not everyone has space as well. But physical health can be really important for mental health too, can't it? Is that something you both? Is that something you researched, Beth, in your time, and something you covered in the book, Paul?
Yeah, Beth, do you want to say something there?
Oh, I was just saying, it wasn't something that I researched during my overwinter particularly, but that is something that has been researched at Antarctica for ESA, and it does demonstrate the importance of physical health and on mental well-being. And I think that that's something as well which is reflected, I think, for all of us. I think a lot of us can relate to just sort of the opportunity to sort of get out of the house and to go on a run or something is really good for people's mental well-being. But even just sort of any kind of exercise, going, for a walk, as Paul was saying, a connection with nature is also beneficial as well. But also doing sort of online classes, and also you can do online classes with friends as well. That's been a way that I've connected with other friends. I've got a friend in Paris and I do the same dance class as her. So it's kind of, it's also a way of sort of zooming together and things like that as well. And just going back to the students as well, I really my heart goes out to them. I've also lived in student halls for longer than I care to think. Being a doctor, I was at uni for 6 years, and I do think that it's a huge challenge for everybody to not have that support that I was lucky enough to have at uni. And I know there are lots of things out there, and I think Paul's done a great job with Ardman. I think that's really great to see projects like that happening, and that there are a lot of helplines and things as well, and support out there for people to access. And I think also it's important to realise as well that there are things you can do. I know that being in a tiny hall of residence, it is difficult to sort of, as I said, define your space, but there are things you can do, like just like keeping your bed as the place you sleep. Don't sit there with your laptop all day, and then like try and have a desk as well, and try and move around, and try and get up and get dressed, and not stay in your pajamas all day, and try and have a bit of a schedule as well. Are all sort of really beneficial things, even though you might not fancy doing it. It was things which definitely helped for me, because I was living and working like one floor, and I was very tempted always to go to my lab in my pajamas and slippers, and sometimes I did, but I always felt better when I didn't. So
Beth, I think from that whole business of space side, and those little bags that they zip themselves up to in the International Space. I think that's a really good point about even in quite restricted environments and spaces, that you can be creative with small spaces too. And on the exercise front, of course, we know from a lot of medical research already about the importance of exercise. But what we're learning during this lockdown is how exercise works with us during this rather unusual configuration that we're fighting. How to exercise during lockdown restrictions and so on. It's not quite so obvious, and I've done 2 backflips over the last. We bought a treadmill actually, just a flat one without anything to hold on to, which I found quite exciting, but also a little bit dangerous. So I've done a couple of backflips where I was fortunately positioned in front of the sofa, so I landed on the sofa. And so exercising at home and all the other health body things are really important, because they give us a base to work from in terms of not only fighting COVID, should we get infected, but also keeping our minds and bodies in the best shape to deal with the psychological oppressiveness and the waiting and the boredom and the irritability that can come in this situation. But just want to add one thing as a practical advice for people, is that when you look into, as we do in the book Cabin Fever, we look into cabin fever on land, at sea, in the air, and in space. You also see, for example, in the experience of adventurous people like Robin Knox-Johnson or Francis
Paul, I'm going to be really rude and cut you off, because we're about to run out of time. But grab Paul afterwards in his cabin fever booth, or the WhatsApp booth, or get in touch with him on the Hoover app.
Yeah.
We are out of time, but do chat afterwards, everyone. And I've got a response to one of Thomas's comments as well. But there's lots in the booths. If you've enjoyed the session, make sure you go to Roland P's panel at 6 o'clock, hearing about UK fighting coronavirus, which is really relevant to this. Coming next is Caroline Cox's Earth observation talk on Cloudcatcher. You can try that out. I want to make sure I thank the speakers and the audience before we get cut off. It's been brilliant. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Beth, and thank you for all the questions in the chat.